Welcome to the History of Psychology show. We're back. I'm your host, Christopher Green from York University in Toronto, Canada. Today, for this special summer episode of the History of Psychology show, I have Daniel Burston, who is a professor at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we're going to talk about his new book, Anti-Semitism and Analytical Psychology, Jung, Politics, and Culture. Dr. Burston has two PhDs, both of them from York University, as a matter of fact, one in social and political thought and one in the history and theory of psychology. And it's my great pleasure to be able to present him to you today. I hope you enjoy the conversation on this very important issue. Carl Jung is one of those interesting figures in the history of psychology, psychoanalysis in particular, who stirs up strong feelings on both sides. There are many people who defend him very strongly, and his sort of spiritual, cosmic approach to the unconscious and to analysis. And there are other people who dismiss him as a kook, and sometimes as an anti-Semite. And rumors about his anti-Semitism have circulated for a long time. And it is important to flesh those out and find out exactly what it is that was going on in Jung's attitudes towards Jews in Europe through the middle of the 20th century when he lived. This book, small as it is, really deals with those issues in a great amount of detail and with a great amount of nuance and sensitivity. And so it's my great pleasure to have Daniel Burston here today. I hope you enjoy the talk. So, Daniel Burston, welcome to the History of Psychology show.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very glad to be here.
So we should get right into it. Your new book, 2021, Anti-Semitism and Analytical Psychology, Jung, Politics, and Culture. There it is. Very readable. Let's get right into that book. I think the first thing we need to do is remind our listeners a bit about Carl Jung's background and his psychological theory. I guess he's generally best known as an early associate of Freud's, one of the few non-Jewish or, Gentile members of the psychoanalytic inner circle. And he spoke as a representative of the psychoanalytic school at that Clark University conference in 1909, where Freud gave his origin and development of psychoanalysis lectures, which I guess are one of the most read things from psychoanalysis even now. But soon after, Jung broke with Freud on issues having to do with the structure and, let us say, the symbolic significance of the unconscious. Could you elaborate a bit on Freud's background for us and tell us a bit about his theory?
You said Freud, but I think you meant Jung. But
I'm sorry, Jung. Could you?
Both.
Yes.
I'm actually going to mention them both because it's easier to explain Jung by contrast with Freud. Freud was a child of the Enlightenment, if you like, and the Enlightenment was their program, their agenda was to dispel ignorance and superstition, and to that end, they sought to demythologize our world picture, They also valorized the rational intellect at the expense of feeling, or what the Romantics call sensibility. Which is something that really rubbed Jung the wrong way. So Freud was an Enlightenment thinker. Jung was a conservative romantic who was mighty suspicious of the intellect. He adopted Ludwig Klage's axiom that the intellect is the enemy of the soul, which is very, if you think about it, that's a very different motto, say, than Freud's motto, which is where the id was, there shall ego be. In other words, replace instinct with reason. Mm-hmm. Jung was saying, no, the intellect is the enemy of the soul. Now, in terms of symbology, the Freudian approach is based on the assumption that the unconscious portion of our minds is childish, atavistic, and antisocial at its core, and that the symptoms and dreams of patients give indirect expression to many of these childish, and antisocial impulses that we harbor in the depths of our unconscious, but do so indirectly and with a view to concealing what those thoughts, feelings, and fantasies are from our conscious awareness. So Freud approached the interpretation of dreams and symptoms, and later on of mythology, from the standpoint of a hermeneutics of suspicion. His aim was to reveal the underlying impulses that are hidden beneath the symbol, that the symbol conceals. Mm-hmm. And whereas Jung took almost the opposite approach, he thought that the purpose of symbols in myth and in dreams and even in a patient's symptoms was to reveal what was attempting to come forth from the depths of the unconscious. And whereas Freud thought that the unconscious portion of our minds resists adaptation to reality and tends to distort our grasp of external reality, Jung thought that the unconscious is a kind of repository of kind of transcendent wisdom that's greater than the ego. So Freud was, if you like, a follower of Schopenhauer, and Jung was more a follower of Schelling. And Schelling really is a very important figure in this discussion, a background figure, because his theory was that there is a kind of a diffusely distributed cosmic consciousness, or kind of a universal intelligence of which individual minds are local expressions, and they can come to self-awareness through individuals, and that was the Jungian approach. So Jung treated the unconscious as a source of not simply as a hindrance to adaptation, but often as something that points the way to a superior level of adaptation.
Right. And I guess that begins to lead us into the question of anti-Semitism. It's a phenomenon which I presume our audience has some familiarity with. Certainly the video of white supremacist marchers in Charlottesville, Virginia a few years ago is a recent example. But anti-Semitism turns out to come in many forms and in many strengths, and you lay those out, I think, in really interesting detail. Early in the book, you offer a definition, and then you introduce a distinction between what you call lowbrow, high-intensity anti-Semitism and highbrow, low-intensity anti-Semitism, especially in the decades prior to the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s. So could you give us your definition of anti-Semitism and then talk a bit about that distinction?
Yes, with pleasure. There are currently, one of the reasons I opted to create my own definition is that there are numerous definitions of anti-Semitism abroad, and they don't all agree. And some of these definitions actually emanate from within the Jewish community itself. So for example, right now you have the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition and a competing definition from the Van Leer Institute called the Jerusalem Declaration. And if we were to try and sort out all the different strengths or the merits and the demerits of these different definitions, it would be an exhausting and possibly futile exercise. So for purposes of psychology, I define anti-Semitism as the irrational fear or belief that by virtue of their heredity or their faith, Jews pose an actual or a potential threat to their non-Jewish neighbors. And the threat can be economic, it can be spiritual, it can have to do with ethical integrity. But in instances like these, the magnitude of the perceived threat varies depending on the level of the intensity of the person's anti-Semitic feelings and their overall personality organization, rather than with any intrinsic characteristics of the feared and hated adversary, the Jew.
Right.
Now, with that said, that's a basic definition, and it covers everything from casual disdain, or what are nowadays called microaggressions, to episodes of violent attacks, and scaling up from there to genocide. And it's intentionally broad. But if you stop there, then you can't really tangle with all the different kinds of anti-Semitism that are evident in the world today. With respect to Jung and his milieu, I think it's important to differentiate between what I call highbrow, low-intensity anti-Semites and lowbrow, high-intensity anti-Semites. And as an example of the latter, the lowbrow, high-intensity anti-Semite, I would give Adolf Hitler, a perfect example. A poorly educated man who was manifestly irrational, contradicts himself all over the place, and just has this implacable hatred towards Jews, which prompts him to incite violence against them. Whereas the highbrow, low-intensity anti-Semite is, generally speaking, a highly educated individual who does not incite people to direct violence, but offers up characterizations of Jewish people that would lend some solace and support to the more virulent kinds of anti-Semites and the less educated anti-Semites. And one example, recent example of this might be Kevin MacDonald's coming to the aid of David Irving in his effort to sue Deborah Lipstadt, the Holocaust historian. I don't know if you know about this, but
tell us about it.
There's a book and a movie about it now. I forget the titles offhand, but Lipstadt was a Holocaust historian who took David Irving to task for his Holocaust minimization and denial. Irving was pretending that far few people were actually killed, and he made all kinds of bogus claims. Irving is essentially a fraud, but he took Deborah Lipstadt to court for outing him as one, and he lost the suit. But in his Kevin MacDonald, a highly educated, well-known or relatively well-known psychologist, came to his defense, testified on his behalf. So I cite this example as the kind of thing that was going on very commonly in Europe. There were different varieties of anti-Semites. There was the virulent kind, and then there were the more educated kind who refrained from inciting to direct violence, but nevertheless made invidious and disparaging comparisons between Jews and non-Jews.
So do you think that this lower intensity anti-Semitism, you talk about it as though it's an authentically lower intensity anti-Semitism, but I would think that many would suspect that it is a kind of veneer, a kind of genteel veneer over what is actually a more intense anti-Semitism. I guess there are all of these different variations, but
no. You're quite right. In some instances, it is just a veneer. Although in the case of someone like Carl Jung, it wasn't entirely. I mean, I think he was, before his encounter with Freud, a low-intensity, highbrow anti-Semite. He was encouraged in that direction by some of his teachers in Basel, by Jakob Burckhardt, he was very fond of the work of Johannes Zollner, the Leipzig physicist, and because of his interest in the supernatural, he championed Zollner, in fact. And Zollner, mind you, was a really rabid anti-Semite, but Jung's brand of anti-Semitism was relatively low-key. It was, how can I say, intensified by his catastrophic falling out with Freud,
right?
Which sort of brought all of his latent anti-Semitism to the fore, and it also, when he saw an opportunity to sort of get even with Freud as he saw it, then elements of ambition and opportunity and the desire to eclipse Freud sort of probably prompted him to act in ways that were more anti-Semitic than he actually felt. But there are people who are genuinely highbrow, low-intensity anti-Semites. I'm thinking, for example, of contemporaries of Jung's like Ludwig Klages, who never, he said awful things about Jews, but never was never a Nazi. And Rudolf Steiner, the founder of Waldorf education, another highbrow, low-intensity anti-Semite.
So let me ask you one more question about sort of the history of anti-Semitism, and then we'll get on to Jung. Of course, anti-Semitism doesn't appear at the start of the 20th century. It dates back in one form or another all the way back to the Church Fathers. But you say there was an important shift in the character of anti-Semitism in, say, the late 18th or early 19th centuries, where anti-Semitism prior to that had been seen mainly as a theological dispute over what a rational person should believe. After that time, the differences between Christians and Jews became essentialized in some sense, in terms of something called race, a term we use all the time now, but we have to remember it was kind of invented in the wake of the Age of Discovery. And it started to be claimed that somehow the very being of Jews was different from that of Christians, that even the act of conversion to Christianity would not be enough to change the character of the Jewish person. Could you expand on that essentialization process?
Yeah, no, that's another important distinction. So in addition to differentiating between highbrow, low intensity, and lowbrow, high intensity anti-Semites, it's useful sometimes in some contexts to differentiate between religious and racial anti-Semitism. For people whose anti-Semitism is rooted in religious or theological preconceptions, our faith or lack of it are central issues, because Jews can, according to them, Jews can supposedly redeem themselves in God's eyes by abandoning their ancestral faith and embracing Jesus as their Messiah or Muhammad as the last of the prophets. So religious anti-Semitism favors conversion as a solution to the Jewish problem, but it typically, in most instances, only accepts converts very grudgingly into the new community. But at least they're assured of not going to hell, at least from their perspective. By contrast, racist anti-Semites and racist anti-Semitism really only starts to show up in the 1840s. They maintain that conversion is not to be encouraged. Quite the contrary. They think it should be absolutely forbidden, because it poses the danger of intermarriage, and with that, the dangers of what the Nazis called race mixing or miscegenation, and the pollution of the gene pool. From their point of view, a person's faith or lack of it has no bearing whatsoever on their fundamental character, which is indelibly inscribed in their genes. And so all the odious characteristics that Christian anti-Semites attributed to the Jews' rejection of Jesus are supposedly now genetically encoded in our DNA. So for them, for a racist anti-Semite, the only solution is not conversion; it's isolation, ghettoization, segregation, or genocide.
So maybe we should expand a bit on this concept of race. It's so common to us now, but it has this important history. It began to be used as sort of the explanation for a whole slew of perceived differences between white Europeans and, well, all of the other peoples of the world who'd been conquered or colonized by Europeans. So placing pretty well anyone in a category of a non-white race implied that they were inferior in some respect to European whites. And soon enough, even the Europeans themselves began to be slotted into this hierarchical organization of different races, the Nordics and the Alpines and the Mediterraneans and the Slavs, and of course Jews, who were also seen as being a race out of place. With the rise of the sort of intense nationalism of the 19th century, Jews were increasingly seen by their detractors as not having played the nation game fairly because they didn't have their own land. They were, as it was said, using the resources of other nations in place of their own. And it was this understanding of what constituted a nation that launched the movement Zionism among both Jews and Christians at the time, although it's thought of mainly as a Jewish movement now, aimed to return Jews in some sense to the land then known as Palestine, but which had also more than 1,000 years earlier been the ancient land of Israel. So could you tell us a bit more about Zionism and who supported it and who resisted it?
Sure. Let's start with Christian Zionism. because, and we'll get that out of the way swiftly and then move on to Zionism proper. Christian Zionism, as it's sometimes called, used to be referred to as Christian Restorationism, and it's a movement that began primarily within Calvinist circles. And oddly enough, it included none other than Carl Jung's maternal grandfather, Samuel Preiswerk, who was a minister and a Hebraist, an Old Testament scholar who advocated for the return of the Jews to their ancestral homeland, despite the brickbats thrown at him by the citizens of Geneva. Theodore Herzl at the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897 actually invoked the name of Samuel Preiswerk, Jung's grandfather, as a supporter of the cause. Now, people like Preiswerk and most Christian Zionists favor the return of the Jews to their ancestral home because they believe that when Jews return to Israel, this will hasten the second coming of Jesus. And that in turn will catalyze a mass conversion of not most, but not all Jews. They'll see the light, they'll see Jesus coming in glory and embrace him.
So this isn't merely returning them to the land and then they are a proper nation, but there's this religious implication to it that is.
Yeah. Nowadays, this is commonly referred to as the rapture. We want to hasten the coming of the rapture. Right. That's how it's referred to in Protestant circles today. Well, that language is fairly new, but yeah. Now, there were others in Christian Zionist circles who merely felt that the restoration of Jews to their ancestral home was simply justice or compensation for centuries of vicious persecution. And these included people in the UK, people like Sir Isaac Newton, Oliver Cromwell, Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, George Eliot, Lord Balfour, David Lloyd George, Winston Churchill, and the poet W.H. Auden. These were all people who were either believing Christians or came out of a Christian milieu and who were strong supporters of Zionism. Prominent Christian Zionists in the United States included Presidents John Adams and Woodrow Wilson, a certain Professor George Bush of New York University, who was in fact the lineal ancestor of both Presidents Bush, and the amazing Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, his good friend the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Congressman John Lewis, Bayard Rustin, and the late great Johnny Cash, and his wife June Carter Cash. So you see, there's quite a range of different kinds of Christian Zionism. But Zionism proper is really a movement from within the Jewish world. It began as a response to an increasingly violent wave of reprisals against the Jewish community after laws that promised emancipation, assimilation, and equality had been enacted in various European parliaments. Despite all this new legislation, Europe clearly wasn't ready for Jewish emancipation, and so pogroms and violent demonstrations against Jewish communities intensified from the 1940s onwards. So Eastern European Jews concluded that there was no cavalry coming to the rescue, and no one to extricate them from their situation. Western European Jews generally weren't subject to quite the same scale and intensity of violence, with occasional exceptions, but Eastern European Jews were the ones who were most vulnerable. And they defined Zionism, the Eastern European Jews defined Zionism as a movement towards the auto-emancipation or the self-emancipation of the Jewish people. And their program involved the revival of the Hebrew language and the establishment of a Jewish homeland somewhere, preferably in the Ottoman-occupied Palestine. And Zionism gained momentum through the 1880s when even more violent pogroms engulfed the whole of the Russian Empire and to a lesser extent, the Habsburg Empire. The person whom most people associate with the birth of Zionism was a man named Theodore Herzl, who was a neighbor of Freud's, lived a few blocks away. He was a Viennese lawyer, journalist, and playwright. And like Freud, he was mostly a secular assimilated Jew whose career had been shaped and deformed by the rising tide of anti-Semitism in the Habsburg Empire. So he's the one people typically think of, Herzl. But not all Jews in that era were Zionists by any means. There were essentially four different constituencies that were either non-Zionist or actually anti-Zionist, two religious and two secular. On the religious side, there were the Orthodox and the Reform Jews. The Orthodox believed that Zionism was an attempt to force God's hand. It betokened a lack of faith in God's justice and mercy and his willingness to eventually bring the Jews back, basically through miracles, through working through history behind the scenes, through supernatural interventions of one kind or another. The Reform Jews weren't that given to supernaturalism or stuff like that, but they believed that Jews had a fighting chance of entering civil society on equal terms with their non-Jewish counterparts in places like the United States and in Germany, where Reform Judaism was probably strongest. And they believed that the Zionist program hindered the process of assimilation for Jews in these countries because it diverted their loyalties away from the United States and Germany and any other country they happen to reside in toward an as yet non-existent entity.
Right.
So those were the two religious constituencies who, by and large, were either non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. There were also two forms of secular Judaism or Jewish culture that were anti-Zionist or non-Zionist. Many Jews in Eastern Europe became radicalized and embraced Marxism in one form or another. Many of them believed that anti-Semitism was simply a tool used by the bourgeoisie to divide the working class. And they believed that when, in a classless society, there would be no more anti-Semitism, and Jews could just live freely and assimilate and just join with their proletarian brothers and sisters, their proletarian comrades. And they were assimilationists. They wanted to assimilate. They wanted to be just regular folks and not carry this label, of Jewishness. By contrast, there were the Bundists, and the Bundists, unlike the Zionists, were deeply in love with the Yiddish language. And they promoted things like sporting leagues, and theaters, and schools, and newspapers in Yiddish. The oldest Jewish newspaper in North America, The Forward, was originally published in Yiddish, and there were a lot of Bundists in that group. Now, the Bundists believed that the Bundists were socialists, but they weren't Marxists, and they believed that if Jews maintained a cohesive cultural identity through this period of crisis, eventually they would be accepted,
right,
as a distinctively Jewish culture. So they were not so much anti-Zionist as non-Zionist. The Bundists and Zionists tended to get along more or less most of the time,
right.
Although not always.
So why don't we get to Carl Jung finally? So we laid out some of the foundations and distinctions among different kinds of anti-Semitism and Zionism at the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah.
We come to Carl Jung, who's born in 1875 in Switzerland. His father's a rural Protestant pastor whose wife is an eccentric woman who claims to be tormented by spirits at night. She has a strong, not just spiritual, but spiritualist, I guess, aspect to her. Carl goes on to study medicine, working with some of the most famous psychological figures of the era, Eugen Bleuler, Theodore Herzl, Pierre Janet. But ends up writing his own thesis on the spiritualist abilities that were claimed by one of his cousins.
Yes.
So how did he come into contact with Freud at this time? And what was the early relationship like?
Well, shortly after he graduated from medical school in Basel, Jung was appointed as the assistant to Eugen Bleuler, who was the director of the Berkolzig Clinic. And it was Bleuler who introduced him to Freud's ideas in the first instance. And I believe that Jung may have acquired a copy of the Interpretation of Dreams as early as 1902.
Right.
But Freud doesn't get a copy of Jung's association experiments until 1904. In 1905, Jung writes to Freud, and they set up a meeting for some years hence. In 1907, they meet for the first time in Freud's home in Vienna. And the meeting goes extremely well. I mean, initially they get along like a house on fire. They're rumored to, or reported to have spoken, just been confined together, speaking one-on-one for 14 consecutive hours. Can you imagine?
Well, that's a good conversation.
I should say that's one heck of a conversation. So they get along very well at first, and they're not aware at this point in their relationship of the theoretical differences that will emerge fairly swiftly. According to Jung himself, things started to go sour with Freud on the voyage back from America in 1909. According to Jung in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, his memoir, he and Ferenczi and Freud were passing the time on the voyage back by analyzing one another's dreams. And one day one morning, Freud had a particularly disturbing dream, and which he recounted to Ferenczi and Jung. And then when Jung asked him to free associates to some elements of the dream, Freud abruptly stopped and said, "I can't do that. It would compromise my authority." And I imagine that Freud's reticence, his withholding of this personal information, contrasted somewhat painfully with, for Jung, with his own sort of more open and disclosing nature at the time. But for whatever reason, Jung said that when Freud said he was afraid of losing his authority, that's when he lost it. In my eyes, that's in effect what Jung says in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. That was the moment, the pivotal moment.
Yeah.
Now, that's Jung's account, but in Deirdre Baer is, I think, Jung's preeminent biographer, and in her account of the voyage to the United States, there were tensions already simmering beneath the surface with Freud and Jung.
Yeah.
And they certainly came to a head at the end of the voyage when Freud was trying to dissuade Carl Jung from pursuing his spiritualist activities and interests any further. He said it would harm the cause, was his rationalization, and he dismissed it all, spiritualism, as nonsense. And as Jung recalled, he got extremely angry and had to, as he put it, bite his tongue. And then there were some explosions, or what sounded like explosions, emanating from bookcases in Freud's study, and Jung attributed them to poltergeists. I forget the term he used, an catalytic exteriorization phenomenon or something like that. That's the term used in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. But and of course, this sort of spooked Freud a little bit. But after that, things started to go downhill. And nevertheless, Freud did appoint Jung as the first president of the International Psychoanalytic Association in 1910. He wasn't deterred by these different signs of sort of turbulence underneath the surface.
He thought he could control this, or he thought that it was not going to not become a major obstacle to their working together.
Evidently.
I'd like to go back to something you mentioned earlier at this point, which is that Freud was kind of a forward-looking modernist, and Jung was, by contrast, this sort of nostalgic romantic.
Yeah.
Can we flesh that out a little bit? I think there's some history of the development of Judaism in the 19th century, I think, which helps illuminate that.
Okay, let's talk about the Jewish dimension for a second, and then we'll get sort of into the meat of this in a little bit more detail. Eastern European Jewry, in Freud's lifetime were, for the most part, leaning towards mysticism and Hasidism, a kind of fervent Jewish piety that's rooted in feelings and in sentiment. And they were looked down upon. The Ostjuden, as they were called, were looked down upon by Western European Jews, who for the most part were followers of the Haskalah, which was is the Hebrew word for the Enlightenment. Let's not forget that the Enlightenment didn't just happen in France, it happened in Germany as well. And one of the leading figures of the Enlightenment in Germany was none other than Moses Mendelssohn, whose ideas sort of gave shape to the Reform Jewish movement that came after his death. But the idea here is that Judaism is a religion of reason and of ethics, fundamentally. So there was a tendency in Enlightenment Jewish circles to emphasize rationalism, rationality, which was in keeping with the Enlightenment sensibility. And Freud was very much, sort of grew out and away from that because, as you know, as anyone who's read The Future of an Illusion knows, Freud believed that in the fullness of time, the dissemination of scientific knowledge would erode or displace religious authority completely, and institutional religion would vanish, and with it, religious feelings and sentiments and beliefs. He really believed that this was progress and it was inevitable. It would happen sooner or later. He hoped sooner, but he expressed confidence it would happen eventually.
Right.
Jung was a product of an anti-Enlightenment enclave, the conservative romantic enclave, and he believed that there was a religious need in the human being that was eternal and unshakable, and that though he wasn't a big fan of organized religion, Jung was much more interested in heretical sects and mysticism and spiritualism than he was in organized religion. But nevertheless, he was a conservative romantic and believed that religion in one form or another would never disappear.
Do we know why? Is there something in his background that helps to explain why he adopts this, I don't know, I don't want to say backward looking, but this kind of nostalgic view of the world that looks toward the Middle Ages more than it looks toward the 20th century?
It's hard to pinpoint, Chris, because I think it's very much just part of his cultural milieu. He came from a very conservative background. His teachers at Basel were all very conservative, and dare I say, anti-democratic and very opposed to the whole notion of progress. Jakob Burckhardt being one example.
Yeah.
But
coming from Switzerland, which has a constitution much earlier than many of the other European countries. Well, the European countries are fighting over the notion of a constitution, constitutional monarchies or democracies, right up to the 1880s, 1890s. Switzerland has a constitution, after the 1848 revolutions. Was he very sympathetic to his mother's concern about the spirits that tormented her at night? Her husband seems not to have been. Was Carl more defensive of that, or?
Well, he writes that he was terrified of his mother's second personality, as he called it.
Right.
But that there was something absolutely compelling about the things she said and did when she was in that state of mind, which was totally different, as he said, from her socially adapted persona as the parson's wife. She was capable of being that person. She was also capable of being someone who made these oracular pronouncements and dire predictions and saying unspeakable things.
Right. Do we think did this leave an imprint on him? Do you think, or do you think
a very, very deep imprint? I'm sure, but it's something that ran in the family. I mean, his mother inherited this propensity for communing with the spirits of the dead from both of her parents, both Samuel Preisswerk and his wife. So this is a family trait. How I don't have an explanation for it. I'm just observing that it is something, a part of his sort of family heritage.
Right. So the split between Jung and Freud was acrimonious. Jung, for his part, blamed it, at least in part, on Jewish traits that prevented Freud from seeing the whole truth of the European mind. Indeed, he claimed that Jews, not being true Europeans, had a different and inferior mind that prevented them from seeing the depths of European mentality. And thus, he claimed that Freud and his followers were foisting their shallow, materialist Jewish views on an innately deeper, more spiritual European understanding of the world. So had Jung entertained these kinds of anti-Semitic beliefs earlier in his life, or was it only after the break with Freud that he adopted these to help explain to himself what had happened?
No, he did. Jung's anti-Semitism predates his encounter with Freud, for sure, and it's entirely intertwined with his interests in the occult and in spiritualism. Let's go back to his days as a student at the University of Basel, where he's elected president of the Zofingia Society, a student organization, which was of long-standing, sort of a well-respected student organization. So as president, he was asked to deliver a series of lectures called the Zofingia Lectures. And he lectured on a variety of topics, including spiritualism. And as I mentioned before, he champions the ideas of a certain Johannes Zollner, a physicist in Leipzig who was both a committed spiritualist, who actually entered into a very acrimonious exchange with Wilhelm Wundt on this subject over the American medium, John Slade, I believe his name was, who was touring Europe at the time. So Zollner was not only a committed spiritualist, he was fiercely opposed to the emancipation of Jews, to their achieving a legal status of equality with other citizens. And he complained frequently and bitterly about the Judaization of science, by which he meant the ascendancy of the materialist sort of paradigm over the vitalist paradigm. Right. And so these things were deeply intertwined in Jung's own intellectual background.
So do you think they became more prominent? Did the split with Jung create an opportunity for him to, meditate on them more intensely, express more anti-Semitic feelings?
Well, the way Freud put it in his he wrote a paper in 1914 called On the History of the Psychoanalytic Movement, which was quite a strange thing to do, given that it was only 1914 and psychoanalysis had only been in existence for 17 years. But he wrote a paper on the history in which he said that Jung had, for the sake of their friendship, had temporarily set aside certain race prejudices, which he had entertained prior to that point. And so from Freud's, Freud had been telling his Jewish colleagues all along that he sensed anti-Semitic sentiments in Jung, but he didn't say so publicly until 1914. And I believe that the fact that he said it publicly offended Jung deeply and actually intensified his anti-Semitism. There were other things about his relationship with Freud that tended to intensify his anti-Semitism, but had Freud confined his remarks on Jung's anti-Semitism to his inner circle or personal conversations, and never actually published something for posterity, I'm not sure if Jung would have reacted so violently. But now Jung wasn't in a position at that time to react in a cogent or consequential fashion, because he was deeply immersed, for lack of a better word, in what Jungians call his nekia, or his descent into the underworld. And of course, there's still a good deal of controversy over this. Was Jung psychotic? Was he inducing trance states deliberately through using mediumistic practices? Was he both? But Jung was in and out of trances, seeing, hearing people who weren't there. He was not in any frame of mind to retaliate. So, but later, when he emerged from this period of disorientation, he started to write more and more about the contrast between the Jewish psychologies of Adler and Freud, which were basically only applicable to Jews. And the Aryan unconscious, which they had misunderstood, and so.
But denies that he's anti-Semitic. I mean, his upsetness at Freud's writings is denial that he's anti-Semitic. And then he goes on to write, oh no, but they have different minds. And
yes,
this is an interesting contradiction to both be arguing for the inferiority of the Jewish mind and denying that one is anti-Semitic.
Well, if you look at history, a lot of highbrow, low-intensity anti-Semites do deny that they're actually anti-Semites. It's only the more virulent kind who openly avow their anti-Semitism, at least in the 19th and early 20th century. It's still true to some extent today.
Right. So 1917, 1918, just after World War I, it became popular in Germany and Austria to claim that the war, World War I, had not really been lost militarily, but somehow Germany had been stabbed in the back, was the phrase they used, by Jews, even though thousands, tens of thousands of Jews had fought and died patriotically for the German cause during the war. Wilhelm Wundt adopted this stance near the end of his life as well. Do you know whether Jung was partial to this explanation of the end of the war as well?
I don't know if he targeted Jews specifically, but he was partial to the idea that Germany had right on its side in the First World War and had been stabbed on the back by, if that's the right phrase, by was called the collapse of the home front. In Germany itself, while it's the soldiers were out waging war against the Allies, there were people in Germany itself who were pushing to end the war quickly, to curtail human suffering and hopefully to set up a more democratic form of governance. These were the people who helped create the Weimar Republic, the short-lived Weimar Republic.
Right.
And Jung didn't like these people. But I don't know if he targeted Jews. I don't know if he mentioned Jews specifically in this connection. I couldn't say.
That's interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
So I think it's important here that we be fair in our discussion of Jung's belief. As you write, Jung's attitude toward the Jewish people and culture was not condemnatory wholly, but it was ambivalent. He continued to have friendships with a number of Jewish scholars, even after his break with Freud. Two of these, who you describe in some detail, are James Kirsch and Erich Neumann. Could you tell us a bit about them and their quite different relationships with Jung over the years?
Yes, absolutely. Kirsch and Neumann were probably Jung's best known Jewish followers, but it should be noted that he had quite a few, notwithstanding his low intensity highbrow anti-Semitism. They had a lot in common, and I want to stress the things they had in common before I attempt to describe their differences. First of all, they were both from assimilated Jewish backgrounds, both from Berlin, of roughly the same age. They had both become involved in the Blau-Weiß, a Zionist movement in Germany, and they were both extremely alarmed and offended by things that Jung said in an essay entitled On the Present State of Psychotherapy, a paper that was published in 1934 and I devote quite a bit of attention to in my book. It's quite a dreadful essay. But in this essay, Jung praised the Aryan unconscious and expressed hostility towards the allegedly Jewish psychologies of Freud and Adler. He made all kinds of accusations about Jews as parasites, cultural parasites, which you alluded to earlier. And we know that they objected because they wrote to Jung independently of one another. Both Kirsch and Neumann were appalled by the things Jung said in that paper.
We should say that this is just the year immediately after the Nazis have come to power in Germany.
That's right. That's right. Now, another thing that they had in common, which is interesting, is that Kirsch and Neumann both emigrated to Tel Aviv to escape Nazi persecution. Kirsch in 1933, Neumann in 1934. And they both declared their allegiance to the Zionist cause prior to their departures from Germany. But Kirsch only lasted 11 months or so in Palestine when he left for England, for London, and basically gave up on the Zionist project. Whereas Neumann lived in Tel Aviv for the rest of his life. And despite some reservations about the Zionist project, the way it was unfolding, was committed to it for the rest of his entire life. So that's an important point of contrast. Nevertheless, even though Neumann remained a Zionist, Kirsch did not, both Kirsch and Neumann defended Jung publicly against the charge of anti-Semitism. And the difference was that Kirsch did this with great ease, whereas it cost Neumann a great deal personally to do so, because he much as he valued analytical psychology, he was also repelled by many of Jung's utterances. Whereas Kirsch became a beloved figure in Zurich, even though he was no longer living in Zurich. He trained with Antonia Wolff, Jung's former analysand and mistress. He emigrated to Tel Aviv, then London, and ended up in Los Angeles. He was nevertheless a much-loved figure in Zurich. He remained on good terms with everyone there. Neumann clashed with other anti-Semites in Jung's circle. And Jung appeared to value Neumann's originality and his courage so much that he tried to protect him from time to time. But it didn't always work. There was at one point in 1936, the same year that Jung published his essay on Wotan, the Zurich Analytical Psychology Club first started discussing the possibility of imposing a quota on Jewish membership. And in 1944, towards the end of the war, they actually did impose one, which lasted until 1950. And in the interim, after the end of the war, Neumann had reestablished contact with Jung, and they started to resume their correspondence and their friendship. But people like Yolanda Jacobi and Antonia Wolff and Karl Freddie Meyer were all very hostile to Neumann. So Neumann was never really accepted in Jung's inner circle, and he had to carve out a niche for himself at the Oranos meetings, which were annual meetings that Jung and some of his friends, people like Heinrich Zimmer, the Indologist, and a few other students of comparative religion, they met every year in Ascona, and Neumann became something of a star, attraction there, and so he did rub shoulders with some members of Jung's inner circle there, but it was never welcome in Zurich.
So do you think that the hostility towards Neumann by the inner circle was because he defended his Judaism in a way that Kirsch did not, or are there just personal sort of frictions between these people? Or
well, Kirsch had persuaded himself that Jung was not really an anti-Semite, and when he initially wrote to Jung to express his dismay at this essay, on the present state of psychotherapy, he divulged the fact that Antonia Wolff had told him in so many words that if Jung had been a German citizen in 1933, he would have voted for the Nazi Party. So he quotes, in his letter, Kirsch quotes Wolff to Jung, and Jung he passes over this remark without saying a word, without saying anything, without repudiating it, without affirming it, just silence. But in his reply to Kirsch, he chastises him for imagining that he could ever be an anti-Semite. And in due course, Kirsch persuades himself that Jung was really not an anti-Semite, but that he was some sort of latter-day prophet who the Jewish people should embrace in order to reestablish their connection with God. He also said that the Jewish people are afflicted by what he called a Christ complex, supposedly rooted in their refusal to acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah, an idea that Neumann, when he discovered this idea of Jung, that Jung and Kirsch shared, Neumann found it baffling and repugnant. And he found it especially baffling and repugnant coming from a Jew like Kirsch. So there was an enmity. So there was a kind of an enmity between Neumann and Kirsch, which people in Jung's inner circle were aware of, and Neumann never stopped pushing back against what he perceived to be an anti-Semitic bias, whereas Kirsch did. He just stopped.
That's interesting. One of the way you describe that, it sounds like this was not just a therapeutic theory for them, but had a kind of quasi-religious
Absolutely.
That this
Absolutely. It's very, very strange that let's assume that there are, quotes, national differences or cultural differences between groups that are identifiable and significant or consequential when it comes to intergroup relations. Jung and Kirsch were both quite willing to explain those differences or the distinctiveness of what they thought of as the Jewish psyche or the Jewish soul, the Jewish collective unconscious, for lack of a better word, by reference to an ancient theological preconception or prejudice that rather than in trying to explain it scientifically. And it's strange, it's rather strange behavior for men of science to engage in this kind of theological conjecture and to invoke it to explain national differences.
It is. So let me just skip ahead a bit. Ask you one last question.
Yeah.
When we come to the 1960s,
yes,
this interesting reversal begins to take place. Jung dies in 61, but the progressive, so-called progressive spirit of the American counterculture begins to rebel against kind of the hyper-rationalist demands of mainstream society. And in its search for alternatives, it conceived an interest in mythological, spiritual, anti-materialistic, in short, romantic views that Jung had been hearkening back to for a half century at that point.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
What was already old in 1900 was so old by 1960 that it seems to have become new again. And Jung's ideas began to enjoy this revival at that time, yes?
Yeah, that's a good way of expressing it, yeah. Yeah, the 60s counterculture infused new energy into the Jungian world, but it also shifted its political center of gravity. The people who were interested in things like mythology and spiritualism, in Asian contemplative practices, in yoga and stuff, those people in Jung's day were generally cultural conservatives and political conservatives as well. They thought of themselves as being a kind of a counterculture, but a counterculture that was opposed to rationalism, materialism, and many of these people were often, not always, but often anti-Semitic. A prime example would be Helena Blavatsky and her followers in the Theosophical movement. But there were lots of different spiritualist groups about and occult groups about that were anti-Semitic, including the Thule Society, of which Hitler's mentor, Dietrich Eckhart, was a member. But in stark contrast to that sort of whole conservative, cultural, sort of incipiently fascistic milieu, the counterculture springs up in the midst of and alongside the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the gay liberation movement towards indigenous people's rights. And the hippies saw themselves as rebelling against pressures towards militarism, mindless conformity, and middle-class respectability. But being anti-Semitic wasn't considered all that cool there because it ran contrary to this ethos of universal love and peace. And being anti-Semitic was also reminiscent of being Nazis, which they weren't fond of Nazis.
Well, no, and in 1960, that wasn't that far in the past.
It wasn't, indeed. So now the hippies were quite taken with things like astrology and the I Ching, tarot cards, ESP, yoga, meditation, Taoism, shamanism, mythology, Kabbalah, and so on. And they read Jung with interest because he was the only psychologist of note whom they were aware of who wrote knowledgeably on these topics and who could. So many people who were immersed in or influenced by the counterculture dabbled in these kinds of practices, and some became quite adept in due course, but many also decided to train to become Jungian analysts because they found Jung's take on these practices, for lack of a better word, compelling to some degree. And that, of course, usually obligated them to go back to school and get credentialed in some way, shape, or form so they could train as Jungian analysts. So it sort of brought them back more into the mainstream. But nevertheless, a lot of these people, their political leanings were liberal or left. And so the training analysts at most Jungian institutes today, at least the ones in the Anglosphere that I'm familiar with, tend to be a much more liberal or left-leaning bunch than Jung's inner circle. And while they're open to different spiritual traditions and modalities, they do tend to be less anti-Semitic than Jung and his followers. The problem is that many of them still aren't willing or able to fathom the full extent of Jung's anti-Semitism at its height, and which is why I wrote this book as a kind of a wake-up call to people like these. And besides, we're living in very dark times. Anti-Semitism is sort of penetrating inwards from the fringes and burrowing into the mainstream, and it's arguably as intense and as prevalent today as it was in Europe in the 1930s. It is in Europe, certainly. It isn't here yet, but it certainly is in Europe. Jungians who ignore Jung's anti-Semitism are also likely to minimize or ignore the real and present danger posed by the resurgence of anti-Semitism today. And that's another reason why I wrote my book.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I'll just show everybody the book one more time. There it is, Anti-Semitism and Analytical Psychology, Jung, Politics and Culture. I'd like to thank you for being with us.
I'd like to thank you for having me, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure too. So that's all for this 12th episode of the History of Psychology show. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to thank Daniel Burston for spending some time with us and telling us about his book. There might be another extraordinary summer episode of the History of Psychology show. I'm not sure just yet. Keep an eye out for it. I hope you'll be there. This is the History of Psychology show.